Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. In yesterday's episode we analyzed the first episode of season 3 in Criminal Confessions, which dealt with the interrogation of Chris Watts. It premiered on Oxygen on December 7th. In the episode on True Crime Rocket Science we spent a little bit of time looking at the article that dealt with the episode from NBC. In this episode we're going to dig a little deeper and we're going to do a similar analysis, very light, very sort of glossing through, but nevertheless I think interesting. And this one based on just looking closer at a couple of points highlighted in another article. Here's how investigators got Chris Watts to confess to murdering his family on E-Online. Before we get there, some good news. I've completed the first draft of the book on Patrick Frazee. I've got to get through some heavy lifting now. I've got to do quite a lot of editing. It's a lot of painstaking and exhausting work, and it's also the reason why this video is going to be relatively short. For those on Patreon, there will be an even deeper analysis coming soon, probably Monday or Tuesday, which will look at the FBI's riskiest move and whether this was a moment of brilliance or a moment of foolhardiness, and that's on Patreon. Again, I want to thank the 100 or so plus patrons that are already there. I'm already halfway through to a tally that's going to require me to go live as soon as there are $500 worth of patrons. I think I've committed to doing a live. Personally, I'm a little bit apprehensive of doing that, but if there's a demand, then I certainly will do it. And as I say, we're halfway there. As for this channel, if you're enjoying the coverage, please subscribe, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a further analysis of Criminal Confessions. What we're doing here is just digging a little bit deeper than we did in the previous episode. And then just a reminder, this post or this episode is based on a light interrogation of some of the points, some of the highlights raised in an E-Online article, how investigators got Chris Watts to confess to murdering his family. Now, what's quite interesting about a snippet from Criminal Confessions, the episode dealing with Chris Watts, is we see that famous sermon on the porch. It's quite interesting, the clip that they provide of Chris Watts. You kind of just see him smiling. It's actually quite incredible just seeing him just looking almost happy, looking almost not relaxed, but certainly all smiles. And he almost seems to be joking when he talks about, what he would like happen next. And, that's known in the trade, I'm sure many of you have heard of this, as duping delight. And so what Agent Tammy Lee says that we may not have been aware of, we may not have known specifically, was that law enforcement actually watched Chris Watts giving this interview. I mean, it was recorded Tuesday mid-morning to midday, somewhere around there, and it was broadcast live that afternoon at about 5 o'clock. And Tammy Lee says in the episode that she thought it was strange that you would talk about that emotional conversation on the news. I think that's a little bit unfair, because Watts didn't actually talk about it. He was specifically asked about it, and he kind of shut down the question pretty quickly as well. So I think one's got to be explicit about that. What's also interesting is in the footage that's been made available, kind of in the trailers and so on, you see Rourke sort of emphasizing that Watts's behavior was, he uses the word, I think, inconsistent. But then he also talks about Watts's concern that he professed to have, using quite sophisticated language. But then he says it seemed cold and calculated. So he's saying that the way that he's expressing emotions even seemed cold and calculated. And so what he seems to be suggesting there through those words is that even Watts's behavior looks, if not premeditated, there just seems to be something around it, as if Watts knows more than he's letting on. And that seems to be the theme with Watts all along, doesn't it? And so in that particular article, eOnline highlight five issues, and we're going to gloss over them very, very briefly. The first one being past tense red flags. We're going to sort of count them down: 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So number 5 is past tense red flags, and that they refer to what's referring to his wife and daughters in the past tense. And this was during the interrogation with Coda. The circumstances were that Coda had looked Chris at photos of his family, and then Watts' response to looking at the photos was that he started referring to them in the past tense. I don't think he referred to them all the time in the past tense, but he did do that. And he also said, for example, that Celeste loved a pair of shoes. And he also said that that Celeste was a girly girl. I'm not sure if that's a typo though, because it refers to a 4-year-old, and we know that Bella was 4. So if we head over to the discovery, and I mean, isn't that the best place just to clarify everything we need clarified? Then we get clarification on discovery page 1225. And what you'll see is the spelling of girly girl is different, which is why if one searches based on the article spelling, Girly, you're not going to find it. And so the discovery is explicit in that it looks like it's Bella that is being referred to as the girly girl. I'm just going to read what Watts says in this section, since it's been referenced. He says, "I remember when they wore that dress. She just wore that dress not too long ago. And I unbuttoned the back of it so I could get her pajamas on, and goes, 'No, Daddy, buttons.'" It's quite interesting, the words there, "No, Daddy," you know. It just brings that back for me a little bit. And he says, "I go, but not got buttons." And it's interesting how he sort of role plays. He literally provides the verbatim of his daughter. And then he goes on to say, "And Bella loved those spaghetti strap dresses." Okay, and so that's in the past tense. Bella loved those spaghetti strap dresses. And then he corrects it to say, "She likes long dresses. She is a girly girl. Always." This use of the word always is now Watts has sort of, I think, caught himself out. He's sort of realized that he's made a mistake, and he's trying to fix the mistake through superfluous answer. So talking more and hiding his sort of error away in a lot of words, in a lot of sort of locution. And then he refers to Cece is just like she once. I always says something that's unintelligible, and then talks about a Supergirl t-shirt, and then he says she loved it. Every time Cece always smiling. Bella, yeah, but like really kinda is like, "Do you want some gum? Say cheese." She said, "You want some gum?" She would have been looking in this picture. Cece just smiled for the camera. You're gonna find them, right? So it's quite a sort of rambling response. It's almost as if Watts is thrown a little bit and maybe quite emotional, and he's got a lot of things going through his mind, and he's trying to make sense, and he's sort of aware that he's making mistakes, and he's also trying to make up for those mistakes and cover up those mistakes, and that probably accounts for a lot of what is going on immediately after the crime. A lot of mistakes, a lot of covering up, a lot of trying to mislead and misdirect. So I would tend to disagree a little bit and say there's some use of the past tense, but it's certainly not. It's not a smoking gun. It's a flag. Certainly, it's a red flag, maybe an orange flag. But yeah, certainly interesting that this was highlighted in the documentary. If we go back through the chronology of the questioning, we see it's starting off where he says, "I'm looking at that picture. Celeste looks like she was wearing winter shoes." And if you go just a little bit below that, he talks about no matter if it was 100 degrees out, she loved those shoes. She always loved those shoes. And Bella, she always wore those flip-flops. She always wore. Again, that is that's highlighted in pink here. That is a bit of a red flag. That first answer to regarding them to that question, loved those shoes, and then he changed it to she always loved those shoes. I know when I first analyzed this, because I did in one of the narratives, I was sort of just comparing it to, how does one speak about, one's children, and one might say, for example, I always loved that or whatever, but in this context, the fact that they're such young children, it's hard to imagine the past tense applying in this situation. I mean, they were still wearing those shoes. That's why they're in the photo, right? What's also interesting in this excerpt is Coda asking, are they little daddy's girl, or probably girls, and then Watts answers that one is. You can say it's a bit of dissociation, but it is interesting how he in a way compartmentalizes the two children, that the one's very different from the other, the one is this way and the one's that way. Just a final thing I want to quickly raise in the discovery is when Watts answers the question, he reduces his children's names to letters, B and C. And of course you may recall that when Watts identified the locations of the children on the tanks in terms of their bodies, he just used their letters, S for Shan'ann and then B and C. In this answer he also refers to Celeste as she'd rampage. Now you might be forgiven for saying, well, I think maybe you taking it too far here, saying she'd rampage, that's not necessarily past tense, but it kind of is. Celeste, if she was still alive, he would say, she rampages, right? If you go a little bit further through that, you can see what sort of changes the tense and says, she was always the one that was gung-ho, and she was always the one that's just like, and then he changes it to she's either go or asleep. She's always the one growling. She's always been, she's a tiger. She's a tiger is kind of more present tense. Bella's the calm mothering one. She's the one that's always, are you okay? You okay? Fine, okay. She's just the sweetest little girl. And then he says she's the one that favors me more than Celeste, who's the one that's like Shan'ann more. So just worth looking at that and just noticing what the agents themselves noticed and highlighted. I don't think this is rocket science really, but it's certainly just interesting to review. Then number 4 in the article, it refers to lie detector pressure. It's just that, and this is quite an interesting bit of mindfuckery in the interrogation. So Coda sort of primed Watts with a couple of questions and whatever, but then he left him to sort of stew in these thoughts, in these worries, these concerns. He sort of purposefully put the seeds of these thoughts into Watts's mind. And so one of the things he said was, we're going to do a lie detector with you tomorrow, and sort of arranged all of that. I'm not sure if the article is very accurate. Maybe there's not a lot of space to go into it, but they're not really accurate about during the lie detector test they didn't actually ask Watts if he was having an affair. I think it was while he was doing the lie detector test that Kissinger was actually sort of talking to the federal agents, and then that information eventually filtered through. And so it was only after the lie detector test, which took quite some time, that they were able to sort of come back, and almost independent from the questions in the lie detector test, they were able to sort of hit Watts with that specific area in which they now knew he was being dishonest. And I think the question of the affair came up during the first interrogation on the Tuesday night, but it was after the polygraph, based on what Kissinger had said to them, that they were able to ratchet up the interrogation up a gear. And so what's really interesting about this is where Michael Rourke talks about they had to be very careful regarding this information about the affair, and these are Rourke's words, because he says there's a fine line to walk there between employing investigative techniques, which we know they were, to get the information that you need, while not going so far as to completely cause the suspect to shut down. And one could actually clearly see this if you were following the interrogation step by step. It was a cautious dance between the suspect, Watts, and the interrogators, increasing the pressure. And Watts is also finding out more and more what they know. He's also, as they pressurize him, they're saying, well, we know this about you, and he needs to know, he feels he needs to know what they know. But then he's also invested enough that he wants to sort of provide excuses and kind of try and get himself out of the bind that he's in. So I think the lie detector test was a brilliant way of getting a lot of information. Just Agent Tammy Lee was very clever in drawing out the lie detector test and getting a lot of information. One could argue that it didn't really take them anywhere, but on the other hand, one can see that by the end of that day he was arrested, and we know what the result was after that. So I don't know, in my opinion, I would give them full marks for a very well executed interrogation. And this brings us to point number 3, vilifying Shan'ann. This is really interesting, and it's a part that I think is not without its irony. I've been accused of victim blaming Shan'ann. I've written quite a few books, and some books address certain aspects more than others. And so in certain books, even readers that appreciate my work basically turn their back on me. They were like, oh, how dare you, I can't believe that you would actually stoop this low, whatever it is. But you actually see the same thing with the investigators. In their attempt to try and extract information from Watts, they were coming at it from a different angle. They were basically saying, did Shan'ann do something? And while I appreciate that doing an interrogation is different to interrogating the narrative, it is the same process of taking things from different angles. When you interrogating a suspect, trying to break down a suspect, you do want to hit him from different angles, often the same question. And so it was through this question, did Shan'ann do something, that Watts actually wanted to answer. He did want to blame her, but he also didn't want to look bad doing it. He wanted to blame her without looking like the bad guy. And so there was definitely quite a bit of mindfuckery in this aspect. You have Coda saying to Watts, I think you're the kind of guy who needs to take responsibility. I don't think that's just a sentiment. I don't think it was just schmaltz. I think Watts, in a way, was that kind of guy. I think him committing the crime in a very sick way was him kind of taking responsibility for the debacle that he found himself in, the debacle that he'd also helped create. It's a way of dealing with something, a way of taking responsibility, but obviously in the most irresponsible way. And so Coda was pretty spot on. I don't think this was uninformed. I don't think it was just gut feel. Maybe some of it was, but I think he'd spoken to some of the witnesses. He's gotten some, he had the resources of the FBI obviously at his disposal, and so he was, developing a profile perhaps of Shan'ann, getting some kind of background on the psychologies of the people involved, and so he hit watch with some of that intel. Wasn't Shan'ann a controlling person? Would she allow him to just order whatever he wanted off the menu? And he would ask specific questions like that, which one can imagine would trigger him and would make Watch want to say, yes, she was very controlling. When I ordered off the menu in Lazy Dog, blah, 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 whatever. And so this was all in a way to get Watts where he wanted to go. And so in a way, it was the vilifying of Shan'ann, the making of her as the scapegoat, was sort of what got the partial confession. So if you take that whole victim blaming idea, you can see when you apply it into an interrogation scenario, it's actually very useful. And as I say, this was the thing that kind of kicked off, that triggered, that was the catalyst for the confession. Watts wanted to sort of blame his wife, and I think what that shows is there maybe was some enmity towards his wife. There was some real unhappiness. There was some sense of, not only does he want to get himself off the hook, but he also feels, there is some truth to the fact that in terms of himself, he had some difficulties with Shan'ann. I know I'm straying into a very tricky area here, but it's quite interesting to hear Agent Lee just saying, they were trying to get to this point and they were pushing and whatever, but then when Watts did say that he'd killed his wife, they said it was gut-wrenching, when he actually said those words. And they were barely audible. I mean, at this point, they'd actually exited the room. So it was sort of, after all their efforts, after all those hours, when Watts finally did say something that was partially truthful, it wasn't to them, it was actually to his father. And as I said, it was barely audible, it was barely truthful as well. But it was nevertheless admitting that, I killed her, I did the same thing to her, kind of thing. And Lee adds that it was the theme of Shan'ann doing something to the girls that I had just given him, that she had just given him prior to leaving the room. But she says, but to actually hear that come out of his mouth was shocking. And this brings us to the number one point highlighted by E! Online. And it was just that despite getting, all of this from Chris, getting the confession in inverted commas, they actually had very little. Basically, all they had was the fact that he'd killed Shan'ann. Pretty much, I wouldn't say everything else wasn't true. I believe him taking the 3 bodies to the car were true. But yeah, there was very little else that they could sort of go on. Of course, where the bodies were disposed of, that was also true. The fact that he'd put them through the hatches, that was also true. And here there's quite a lot of emotion from Tammy Lee. She says, 6 months after the murders, she wanted to hear him say that Shan'ann didn't murder her children. It's quite an interesting way of putting it, because that was already clarified. I mean, he'd been sentenced. It was a done deal. He'd admitted to this by signing the plea deal, right? So her saying, she needed to hear him say that is quite interesting. I don't know if it was essential to the investigation. Maybe it was. Maybe it was essential to the latter part, the civil suit for what the Ruseks needed to get out of it. But one can think in terms of the investigators that they wanted a bit of closure. They'd worked so hard on the suspect, and they just wanted him to at least admit to this part, and he did. Of course, he's now gone further and sort of muddied and mixed up that whole confession. So one wonders, does she want to go and speak to him again? Will they speak to him again? I don't see any legal apparatus surrounding that. There's no lawsuit or money at stake. So one wonders, will they return a fourth time, or basically a third time? It would be the fourth confession if he confesses, but it would be their third attempt. So I wonder what you guys think. Do you think the investigators should go back? Do you think there's any point? Do you think they should give Watts a couple of years, maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years? Do you think it is case closed, or do you think they're going to return and talk to him again? Do you think Watts would want to talk to them again? Right, and that's it for this episode. I will be going a lot deeper and spending a bit more time in an episode on Patreon, likely up tomorrow or the day after, and that'll be also dealing with this episode on criminal confessions, and that'll be just studying effectively the FBI's riskiest move. What was it? Was it well advised? Was it foolish? What may have happened if they'd not taken that risk? Then just a heads up for what's coming this week on YouTube. I'll be analyzing, also by going through the discovery and going through the interrogation with Coda. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on analyzing what I call the tale of two Chris's, so you can look forward to that. And then I'm going to be doing some even deeper diving into those interrogations, looking at this whole idea of the vilifying of Shan'ann and why it was successfully employed in the interrogation. And again, that's also going to be on Patreon. So look out for that. Watch this space. Also watch out for Murder Most Foul coming very early in the week. Otherwise, subscribe, like, share, leave a comment. If you're enjoying this content, head on over to Patreon just for deeper analysis. And thank you for all the support there. And I'll see you guys next time.